Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery. Hey, there we go. We've got our live virtual studio audience, and we have got our 2 chapters ready and waiting in the pipeline. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to do, or aim to do, chapters 4 and 5 of Masechet Zevachim. Chapter 5 should be familiar to all of us, and we'll see why when we get there. But first of all, for starters, starter for 10, let's get chapter 4 up on the screen. Can everybody see it there? Yeah. And everybody can see it now on YouTube as well. So we're going to start with chapter 4. And we are talking about pigul still. If you remember, we mentioned pigul last week. Pigul is the status that can be conferred on a sacrifice if one of the 4 key stages is done with the wrong intention. Which wrong intention, I hear you cry? The wrong intention that you are planning to eat or burn that sacrifice at the wrong time. So we said if you are sacrificing, if you are slaughtering or collecting the blood or transporting the blood or sprinkling the blood, and you have the intention that something that it's going to be eaten or burnt at the wrong time, then you infuse that sacrifice with pigul status. And a person who eats from that sacrifice is now going to be liable to spiritual excision, to kares. So we're still in the world over here of pigul. And if you remember, we had seen 2 opinions. We had seen the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda last week, who had told us that if you have the intention of zman before having a bad intention of time, not of time, of place, right? So meaning, in one process, you have a zman machshava, and in another process, you have makom machshava. So he says, as long as the zman has come first, it will still remain pigul. But if you have a place machshava followed by a time machshava, then it won't be pigul. That was the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Then we had the opinion of Chachamim, who say it's only pigul if you just have the one type of machshava. If at any point there was another type of machshava, then it's not going to have a status of pigul, whether it's before, whether it's after. Once you've brought another wrong machshava into play, it won't be pigul. It will be invalid, it will be disqualified, but there won't be a punishment of kares if a person was to eat it. So we're going to see in the first couple of Mishnayos that we are not really taking Rabbi Yehuda into account at all, which means that from the point of shchita, the first of our 4 processes, from the time of slaughtering until the sprinkling, you must only have a machshava of chutz lezmana, of doing something at the wrong time. If there are other types of machshavos, then it's not. So you have to get all the way to pigul with just one chutz lezmana thought. Okay, so we start with Mishnah Aleph of chapter 4. Beis Shammai Omrim, Beis Shammai say, Kol hanitanim al mizbeach hachitzon. Any korban which has a sprinkling, an application of blood on the outer altar, which is the main big altar in the courtyard. So anytime you have a korban where blood needs to be sprinkled on the outer altar, which we'll see in the next chapter what that would exclude, right? But generally, there are sacrifices that only get sprinkled on the outer altar. The Mishnah says, She'im nesanan matana achas kiper. So we're going to see that there are some sacrifices where you actually have to sprinkle blood on 4 corners of the altar, and there are some sacrifices where you only have 2 corners that require sprinkling of blood. But Beis Shammai say that if you get to the point of zrika and you do at least one application on one corner, right? So the Beis Shammai say kiper, you have achieved atonement. You have, so to speak, ticked the box of that korban. It has reached its aim, its target. You're supposed to sprinkle perhaps on 2 or on 4 corners, but says Beis Shammai, if as long as you've got to 1 sprinkling, right, without a chutz lizmano mindset, you will fulfill and you will achieve kapara, you will achieve atonement. Continues the Mishnah though, v'chatas, where they korban chatas, it's where it has to be sprinkled on all 4 corners of the altar. So he says, shtei matanos, you need to get to at least 2 sprinklings to be able to achieve kapara. Okay, so Beis Shammai basically saying that if you did 1 sprinkling and then had chutz lizmano intentions on the rest of them, it's not going to be pigul. And similarly, if you do 2 sprinklings for a chatas and then have the wrong intention on the other ones, it's not going to be pigul. That's what we're trying to say over here. Beis Hillel say, Af chatas shenasana matana achas kiper. Even by korban chatas, which needs to be sprinkled on all 4 corners, if you manage to do 1 of them, then you will achieve kapara. You will facilitate and fulfill the atonement, the aim and the target of that korban. And even if you have the wrong mindset on any of the other sprinklings, it won't be called pigul. It will perhaps be called pasul, but it won't be called pigul. Lefichach, says the Mishnah. Therefore, in nasal es harishona, if you did the first placement of the blood, kasikna, in the right way, ve'es hashliach chutz lizmana, and then you went and did a second sprinkling with the chutz lizmana mindset, says the Mishnah, kiper, you will achieve kapara, you will achieve the desired effect of the korban. Nasam es harishona chutz lizmana, but if you got to zrika and you went and you put the first sprinkling with that wrong mindset of chutz lizmana, ve'es hashniya chutz lemekoma, and then on the second sprinkling you went and you did a chutz lemakom, the wrong place mindset. So what should it be? We've said previously that if you have mixed intentions, Chachamim are going to say nothing doing, it can't be pigul. But the Mishnah says over here that if you have a chutz lizmano intention on the first sprinkling, on the first placement of dam, the Mishnah says pigul. It will be pigul because you've already achieved the kapara from that 1 sprinkling. At the very least, you have to get that 1 sprinkling right, but you didn't. You got it wrong. So that's why the Mishnah says pigul. It is going to have the status of pigul, v'chayavin alav kares. And if a person eats it, they are going to be liable to spiritual excision. Mishnah base. With regards to sacrifices, which again, we'll see more detail on this in the next parak, but with regards to sacrifices where you're sprinkling on the inner golden mizbeach, we're going to see that each sprinkling is ma'akev, meaning that you need to achieve every single sprinkling, every single application in the right way. But if you don't, you're going to make it pasul, you're going to make it disqualified. There's not going to be pigul with korbanot that have the blood applied in the inner altar, on the inner mizbeach, unless you had the mindset for all 4 sprinklings, because all 4 of the placements of the blood are integral and are ma'akev, as we say in Hebrew. So, says the Mishnah, Kol hanitanin al mizbeach hapnimi. All of the sacrifices that require blood to be applied to the inner altar, she'im chiser achas min hamatanos lo kiper. If you are lacking 1 of the placements in the right way, lo kiper, it's not going to achieve kapara, it's not going to achieve the atonement, it's not going to achieve its desired target. Lefichach, says the Mishnah, therefore, im nasan kulan kasiknan, if you did all of them appropriately, Va'achas shelo kasikna, and you did one of them inappropriately. So you had the wrong intention on one of those sprinklings. Puzzle, again, it can't be pigul, it's going to be puzzle, it's going to be disqualified. Ve'ein bo kares, but there wouldn't be the penalty of kares, of spiritual excision, if that person went and consumed it. By way of introduction to Mishnah Gimel, the basic aspect of pigul is dependent on two steps. Step number one is that you've thought about eating the sacrifice, or you've thought about burning the sacrifice, or you've thought about sprinkling the sacrifice outside of its right time and place. Number two, if you eat the korban after it was rendered pigul, then you are going to be chayav kares. So there have to be those two components for the maximum impact of pigul to be realized. But what's interesting is that when it comes to sprinkling and when it comes to burning, these stages are what we call matirin. What does matirin mean? Matirin means that these steps are crucial to unlock other parts, other dimensions, not dimensions, makes it sound like other worlds, but they are stages of the sacrificial process that must take place in order to unlock the ability to do other parts of the sacrificial process. So there are other things beyond just the shchita, the kabbalah, the holacha, the zrika. There's a whole range of other things that could accompany a korban. And to be able to unlock the next step, as it were, right, that's what we mean by matirin. We are permitting those next steps to take place. So burning and sprinkling in the appropriate way allow us to do other parts, other actions, other accessories and things like that for different korbanot. And it's only those things which we can do because of a previous process that can be pigul. So these actions that we're going to see now in this Mishnah, they will unlock the next stage, but they won't make a sacrifice pigul. So says the Mishnah, Ve'elu dvarim, these are the things, she'ein chayavin aleihem mishum pigul, which they are not going to make a person liable for kares if that sacrifice was pigul. So we said that if you eat a sacrifice which is pigul, you can be chayav kares. But what if you consume any of these other things? Okay, so the Mishnah says, hakometz, if a person was to eat the fistful of flour and oil that goes with a korban mincha, okay, because there's nothing that comes before that, there's nothing that's matir that thing, you're not going to be chayav because of pigul. Mishnah continues, v'halavona, frankincense, which is burnt in its entirety, and again, it has nothing before it that unlocks that part of the process, you're not going to be chayav kares. V'hakatoras, similarly with incense, you're not going to be chayav kares. Uminchas kohanim, the mincha, the flour offering of kohanim, which is entirely burnt, is not going to make a person chayav kares. Uminchas kohen mashiach, the flour offering of the kohen, which was brought each day, half in the morning and half in the afternoon, and it was all burnt up. So that is not going to make a person chayav kares. V'hadam, blood, is not going to make the person chayav kares. V'hanasachim habayim b'fnei atzman, and nasachim, which we translate as libations. So after a shlamim sacrifice and after an olah sacrifice, you would bring a mixture of wine, flour, and oil, and that would be called nesachim. But it's not going to make somebody chayav kares. Divrei Rabbi Meir. That is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. The Chachamim say Even the nesachim, the libations, the peripheral additional components, they are also going to be have the same halacha here. And the reason for that is because you could be bringing these things because of a korban or not because of a korban. And so the Chachamim are going to say there's no pigul that applies to all of that. Continues the Mishnah. What about log shemen shel metzora? When a person was a metzora, diagnosed with tzoras, and needing to bring a process of sacrifice to be able to be made pure again. So the log shemen, which was an amount of oil that would be brought by this metzora, it would be brought with his korban asham, his guilt offering. And the process would be that there would be blood from the korban asham that gets sprinkled on his right ear and his right thumb and his right big toe, and then they would take this oil and they would sprinkle the oil 7 times towards the porochet, towards the curtain inside the Beis HaMikdash. And then he would put it, I think, also on those parts of his body. So the log shemen shel metzora, Rabbi Shimon says, Ein chayav in alav mishum pigul. Rabbi Shimon says it can't also be liable under the status of pigul. So if that korban asham becomes pigul, it's not going to impact the log shemen, according to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Meir says chayav in alav mishum pigul. Shadam ha'asham matira. It is going to be liable under the prohibition of pigul, under the restrictions of pigul. Why? Shadam ha'asham matira. Because the blood, the application of the blood is what causes the log shemen to now be part of the process. It unlocks the log shemen, the measurement of oil, to now be applied. Without the blood, you wouldn't apply it. So you need the blood to unlock that step. Whereas the other things that we've been seeing, they haven't had something unlocking the ability to bring them, and that's why they've not been included. But Rabbi Meir says over here that with regards to the oil that the metzora has to bring, because it can only be brought if the blood has previously been done, that is why, according to Rabbi Meir, it is now going to fall under the prohibition of pigul. So Mishnah Daled, we're now going to see what we're talking about in terms of different sacrifices or different parts of the process unlocking the next thing. So the Mishnah says, it's going to elaborate on this concept. Mishnah says, Mishnah Daled, Ha'ola, when it comes to a korban ola, dama matir es besara. Once you've sprinkled the blood, that now unlocks, it permits the besara, it permits us to now burn the flesh up on the mizbeach, v'ora lakohanim, and to be able to give the hide to the priests. But if you didn't sprinkle the blood, then those things can't yet be done. Ola sa'of, when it comes to the bird ola offering that gets completely burnt up, dama, the sprinkling of the blood, matir es basara la mizbeach, it permits, it unlocks the next stage, which is to burn up the meat, the flesh, on the altar. Chata sa'of, the bird offering for a sin offering, dama, the blood, matir es basara la kohanim, it permits you to now give the meat, the flesh, to the kohanim to be able to eat. Parim hanisrafim, the bulls that get burnt up on the mizbeach, usirim hanisrafim, and the, sorry, not on the mizbeach, parim hanisrafim, bulls that get burnt up, where the fats get burnt on the mizbeach and the flesh gets burnt outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Usirim hanisrafim, goats, again, where the fats are going to be sprinkled on the mizbeach and the meat is going to be burnt up outside the Beis HaMikdash. Daman matir es murehen lakarev. The sprinkling of the blood now allows you to burn up the fats on the mizbeach. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Kol she'eino al mizbeach hachitzon kashlamim, ein chayavin alav mishum pigul. Anything which doesn't get burnt on the altar, right? So, no, that's... My apologies. Let me try that one again. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kol she'eino al mizbeach hachitzon kashlamim. Any sacrifice that doesn't have its blood sprinkled on the outer mizbeach, like a korban shlamim. And the reason why it singles out korban shlamim is because that is the source for the prohibition of pigul. So, and it has its blood sprinkled on the outer altar, on the outer mizbeach. So Rabbi Shimon says, if you have a korban where the blood is not being sprinkled on the outer mizbeach, then it's not going to be subject to pigul. Ein chayavin alav mishum pigul. So a very deviant stance from what we've been seeing. So what that would mean is, even if you had the wrong machshava, chutz lizmana, according to Rabbi Shimon, if it's not a sacrifice that has blood sprinkled on the outer mizbeach, it's not going to be liable for pigul. The Chachamim obviously had said differently, and the halacha would be like the Chachamim. But just interesting there, such a different stance that Rabbi Shimon takes in Mishnah Dalet. Okay. Have I missed anything there? Okay. Mishnah Hey. Mishnah Hey. Let's scroll down a little bit. It's a hard perek, granted, but hopefully some of what I've been saying has been relatively clear. So Mishnah Hey, we're going to be discussing sacrifices that can be brought by non-Jews. So what statuses can be affected with a sacrifice that's brought by non-Jews? So says the Mishnah, Kodshe Nochrim, sacrifices that can be brought by non-Jewish people. Ein chayavin aleihem mishum pigul nosar v'tameh. So even though it can be invalidated with the wrong thoughts, right? Even though it can be invalidated with the wrong thoughts, it's not going to have a status of pigul, and so you're not going to be chayev for kares if it gets eaten. So pigul won't apply to a sacrifice that's brought by a non-Jew. Neither will nosar when we leave over the meat till the wrong time. V'tameh, and if a person eats the meat in a state of ritual impurity, so that's not going to apply to these sacrifices brought by non-Jews. V'ashochatan b'chutz, if a person slaughters those sacrifices outside the temple, right? So you have a Jew who comes along and slaughters this sacrifice in the wrong place. Says the Mishnah, Patur divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says that you are going to be Patur. Rabbi Yossi, am I in the right Mishnah here on the screen? Where's Rabbi Shimon coming along? Oh, I see. So for some reason the English here, whoever's following in the English, that says Rabbi Shimon. I think in the Hebrew it says Rabbi Meir, so I'm not sure why it says Rabbi Shimon on the screen. But anyway, so if the person slaughters them outside the Beis HaMikdash, outside the Azara, they're going to be patur, according to Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Yossi says Mechayev, they would be liable for having slaughtered it in the wrong place. Continues the Mishnah, Devarim she'ein chayavin aleihem mishum pigul, things which are not subject to the prohibition of pigul, nonetheless, according to Rabbi Yossi, chayavin aleihem mishum nosar, mishum tamei, chutz min adam. So they are going to be subject to nosar if you eat them after the time has passed, or you eat them in a state of ritual impurity, except for the blood. The exception for Rabbi Yossi is the blood. Now we have Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Omer, b'davar shedarchan lehe'achel. Only things which are usually eaten would one be liable for. Aval, ha'etzim, wood, v'halavona, and frankincense, which theoretically could be eaten, but it's particularly bitter, so it's not included. V'hakatoras, and the incense, ein chayavin aleihem mishum tuma. The person is not going to be liable if they eat any of those things in a state of ritual impurity. Finally, Mishnah Vav of this chapter. What is the right mindset that one should have when they are performing a sacrifice? L'shem shisha devarim hazevach nizbach. 6 things are appropriate to be thinking about when they are offering up a sacrifice. Says the Mishnah, L'shem zevach. You're supposed to have in mind what the name of this korban actually is. L'shem zoveach. You're supposed to have in mind the owner of the sacrifice, the person who has come to the Beis HaMikdash to give this korban. L'shem Hashem. You're supposed to have Hashem in your mind when you do the sacrifice. L'shem Ishim. You're supposed to have in mind that the korban is going to be burnt up on the Mizbeach. We're not just coming to the Beis HaMikdash for a barbecue. We're coming here for these things to be burnt up. So that is something else that they should think about. L'shem Reach. The smell, the aroma should be in one's mind when offering up the sacrifice. What I've got in my notes here is that you have to try and do this in a way that the smell comes up from the altar and not try and burn everything beforehand so it doesn't smell. Don't really understand my notes over there, but it could make sense to some of you. And the final thing is l'shem nichoach. You have to have in mind that the sacrifice is going to be pleasing to Hashem. Reach nichoach, a pleasing aroma. That it is going to be a satisfactory korban and done properly to the way that Hashem has prescribed it. V'hachatas v'ha'asham, and when it comes to a korban chatas, a sin offering, or a guilt offering, a shame offering, then also l'shem chet. You have to have in mind the sin, the mistake, the reason that you are actually coming to bring this korban. Omar Rabbi Yossi says, Af mi shelo haya belibo l'shem echad mikol elu kasher. He says that even if you did not have one of these things in your mind, it's still going to be kasher. Shu t'nai beis din, because the beis din say she'ein ha'machshava holeches ela acha ha'oved, because they say that actually the intent is following the one who is performing the sacrifice. So it's not about what the owner has in mind, but the only person who can invalidate this korban is the person doing the avoda, not the owner. So I have in my notes here again that Rabbi Yossi would say it's better just to try not to think about anything other than what the korban is for, so that you don't come to make any mistakes. But still, it's a fascinating idea. I'm not aware really of many other sources that talk about the kind of mindset that one should have when performing different mitzvot. So it's fascinating to see the Mishnah being so upfront about what a person should be carrying in their mind and thinking about as they go through the sacrificial process. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, Mazel Tov on completing chapter 4 of Maseches Zevachim. And so now we move into Perek Hey, to chapter 5. Now, this should look familiar because we say it every single morning in the Korbanot section of our davening. Before we get to Pesukei Zimra, we say this chapter of Mishnayot. It contains within it the basic halachas, the basic laws of all the different Korbanot. And one of the reasons why we use this chapter in our davening every day, first of all, is to do with sacrifices, and prayer is to do with sacrifices. That's number one. Number two, we've said our brachot just a few minutes ago on Birkat HaTorah. We have done the blessings that we need to say on the mitzvah of learning Torah, and so we have, if we pay attention to the actual layout of Birkat HaTorah, so we say La'asok b'divrei Torah v'harevna, etc. Then we say Asher Bachar Banu, and then the next thing that we do is we quote a Mishnah and we quote Gemara. right? So that we're fulfilling immediately the concept of learning Torah immediately after we're saying the brachot. But we do the same in the run-up to Pesukei de Zimra. We have a chapter of Mishnayot, and we have a whole piece from the Gemara. We have Rabbi Shmuel, right? So this as well, this is fulfilling our limud Torah every morning. It's fulfilling our mitzvah of learning Torah after just having made those brachot a few moments ago. So that's reason number 2 why this chapter appears in our Siddur every morning. And number 3, I believe one of the reasons why this chapter was chosen is it's the only chapter in the whole of the Talmud which doesn't have any arguments in. Amazing. We are going to go through these Mishnayos, and there's not going to be a single Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Meir Omer, nothing like that. It is just straightforward Mishnayot without any arguments whatsoever. And so it's an easy chapter to learn and to go over and to reflect on each day, because we don't have to sit there trying to remember every single idea and every single opinion and see how it all balances and figure it all out. So the idea is this is quite a straightforward chapter with the basic fundamental laws of Korbanot, no machlokas in. It's appropriate because it talks about sacrifices, and prayer is in place of our sacrifices. So that is why we have this chapter in our Siddur. And what we're going to see is, now we're going to see all of the different rules, but it's going to start with a hierarchy. We're going to start with the most severe korbanot, and we're going to work our way down to the least severe korbanot. So we start off in Mishnah Aleph with Kodshei Kodshim. If you remember, we have higher tier sacrifices and Kodshim Kalim, lower tier sacrifices. We start with the Kodshei Kalim. We're going to be talking about the Chatas. We're going to be talking about the sin offering. We're going to be talking about the Olah, the completely burnt up offering, and the Shlamim. We're going to be talking about the peace offerings. So that's what we are going to be getting to. But for now, says the Mishnah, Ezehu Mekoman Shel Zevachim. What are the locations? Where are the places where these sacrifices are supposed to take place? So says the Mishnah, Kodshei Kodshim, Shchitasan Batzafon. Any of the Kodshei Kodshim, any of the higher tier sacrifices get slaughtered on the northern side. And if we can remember our diagram of the Beis HaMikdash, that's the southern side where the altar is, and down here is the northern side. Oh, I'm pointing completely in the wrong place. That is the northern side, that's where the altar is, and down here are where all of those hooks were to be able to tie up the animals to be able to slaughter them. So all of the Kodshei Kodshim get sacrificed in this part of the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so we start with, in terms of most severe sacrifices, we're going to start with the sacrifices of Yom Kippur. And the reason why these are the most severe and the highest level is because the blood is going to be making its way all the way to the Holy of Holies, all the way to the Kodesh HaKodashim on Yom Kippur. So that's why we start over there. So, says the Mishnah, Par v'sa'ir shel Yom Kippurim, the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur. So the one bull and the one ox of Yom Kippur, which are sin offerings, korban chatats. Nothing gets eaten. The flesh gets burnt outside of the Beis HaMikdash, but the blood makes its way all the way to the Kodesh HaKodashim. So the par and the se'ir, the goat, the if you remember when we were learning Maseches Yoma, we talked about the two goats, the scapegoat, which gets cast away, and the goat that gets processed in the Beis HaMikdash. So we're talking about that goat and the bulls of Yom Kippur, Shchitasan b'tzafon, they get slaughtered in the northern side. The kibul daman bichli shares b'tzafon, and you collect the blood in a bowl in the northern side. The daman ta'un hazaya al bein habadin, and the blood must be sprinkled between the poles of the ark inside the Holy of Holies, via la paroches, as well as being sprinkled onto the kapares, onto the curtain that separates the heichal from the Kodesh HaKodashim. Right, we saw all of this in Maseches Yoma. The al mizbeach hazahav, and it also gets sprinkled on the golden altar inside the heichal. Matana achas mehen ma'akaves. Says the Mishnah, even if you get one of these wrong, it's going to be invalid, right? Meaning, matana achas, one sprinkling, any of these sprinklings, ma'akaves. It prevents the whole korban from being done successfully. So any one of these placements can disqualify the korban. Says the Mishnah, Shiare Adam, the rest of the blood that doesn't get used for sprinkling, and if you remember, there was a whole mixing process that took place with this blood. So the remainder of this blood, Haya Shofech al Yesod Ma'aravi Sham Mizbeach HaChitzon, it gets poured onto the western foundation of the outer altar. It gets poured onto the base of the altar on the western side. And interestingly, the western side is the first side that you would encounter as you are approaching the altar. So if you are, why would that be? Because you're coming from, you're coming from the Heichal, you're coming from where the Kodesh HaKodashim is, right? So behind me is the Kodesh HaKodashim, which is west, and so if I'm walking out to the Mizbeach, I'm going to encounter the first side that I see is the western side of the altar. So the Mishnah says that it gets poured on the foundation, on the base of the western side. Im lo nasan, however, if it doesn't get placed on that side, lo ikev, that is not ma'akev. That's not gonna disqualify the whole korban, but it's supposed to be put on the western side. So that is our first sacrifice in this chapter, the sacrifices of Yom Kippur, where we said it gets slaughtered and collected on the northern side. It gets sprinkled in the Kodesh HaKodashim and on the curtain and on the golden altar. And if you get any of those sprinklings wrong, then you've lost the game. And the rest of the blood gets poured on the western side of the foundation of the altar, of the Mizbeach. Mishnah base, one level down. 3 korbanot, which get sprinkled on the inner Mizbeach, on the inner golden altar, but they don't get sprinkled in the Holy of Holies. And the flesh, we'll see, is burnt outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So says the Mishnah, Parim hanisrafim. At the beginning of Parshas Vayikra, which we read just a couple of weeks ago, we read about a korban, which would be brought if most of the community ended up violating a mitzvah in the Torah because the Beis Din told them to, or because a Kohen Gadol had got the wrong ruling. So if we're misled to do an Aveira and we thought it was mutter, then we have to bring a sacrifice. And that's what we're referring to here. Parim hanisrafim. Usirim hanisrafim. And goats that would have to be brought as a sacrifice. If the Jewish people were misled to worship Avodah Zarah inadvertently from a wrong ruling by the Beis Din, they would have to bring a goat offering. So that's what we're referring to here. So where would these get processed? So Parim hanisrafim, Usirim hanisrafim. The bulls and the goats that have to be burnt up, shchitasan b'tzafon, they get slaughtered on the northern side. The kibul daman b'chli shares b'tzafon, their blood is collected on the northern side. The daman taun hazaya ala paroches, their blood gets sprinkled on the curtain. V'al mizbach hazahav, and on the golden altar, but not on the ark inside the Kodesh HaKodashim. That was only Yom Kippur. Says the Mishnah, Matana achas mehen makeves. Every single one of these applications is crucial. If you make a mistake on one of them, it's going to ruin the whole thing. Shiare hadam, the rest of the blood, haya shofech al yesod maravi, shom mizbeach hachitzon. It gets poured onto the western foundation, onto the western base of the altar, of the outer altar. Im lo nasan lo ikev. If this was not done in that right place, then it doesn't ruin the whole thing. Says the Mishnah note to finish off, Elu va'elu, with regards to the sacrifices mentioned in Mishnah Aleph and the sacrifices mentioned in Mishnah Beis, Elu va'elu nisrapim v'beis hadashem. The carcass of the animal is burnt outside of the walls of the Beis Hamikdash, in the place of the ashes, b'beis hadashem. That's where the carcasses of those animals would get burnt up. Mishnah Gimel, one level down. Going to be talking about regular korbanot chatat, sin offerings. Okay, so we're still within the realm of kodshei kodshim, of the higher tier sacrifices, but we've gone from Yom Kippur down to the animals that would be brought if the Jewish people ended up sinning because they were misled, they were told the wrong ruling. And now we come to a regular korban chatas. So a regular korban chatas did not get completely consumed. All right, we'll see a korban olah does get completely consumed. So the question is asked, well, why are we doing a korban olah, a korban chatas first? Surely the olah is higher level because the whole of the meat gets burnt up. But what we're going to see is that the korban chatas has 4 applications of blood on the mizbeach, and the olah only has 2. So that is why the Mishnah brings the chatas first. So we're going to be talking about the korban musaf that gets brought. That's what's included here. Korban musaf is a type of chatas. So we're going to be talking about the korban musaf that would be brought on every Yom Tov and on every Rosh Chodesh. And we're going to be talking about all of the sin offerings that would be brought by individuals if they did if they violated something by accident, b'shogeg. So that's what we mean when we talk about these chatat sacrifices. We're also going to see that the blood would get sprinkled on the upper part of the mizbeach, and because the altar was so tall, you wouldn't be able to reach straight away all the way up to the top. You'd have to go up the ramp a little bit, halfway up, and then you'd have to go around the altar on a ramp that was, or a ledge that ran around the perimeter of the altar. We're going to see that the Kohen would walk up and would navigate his way around this ledge to be able to sprinkle the blood. So says the Mishnah Gimel, Chatos hatzibur v'hayachid, when it comes to the public and private sin offerings. Elu hein chatos hatzibur. These are the public sin offerings, communal sin offerings. Seirei Rashi Chadashim, the goats that were brought as a korban chatas for Rosh Chodesh each month, v'shel muados, and for Yom Tov. Shchitasan b'tzafon, they would be slaughtered in the north. The kibul daman, and their blood would be collected, b'chishores b'tzafon, in a bowl, in a sanctified vessel in the north. V'daman ta'un, arba matanos, al arba koranos. And you would need to sprinkle 4 times on each of the 4 corners of the outer mizbeach. Ketzad, which direction should they be going in? Well, the Mishnah says, alav hakeresh, you would go up the ramp, ufana lasovev, and you would turn right to be able to work your way anti-clockwise around the altar. So, as we come up the ramp, our back is towards the south, and our right side to go anti-clockwise is towards the east. Okay, so we're going halfway up the ramp, and we're going to be going around the ledge, around the outer altar. So we turn to start navigating our way around. The first corner that we're going to encounter is the southeastern corner. We're going to put blood on that corner. Then we carry on anti-clockwise. Mizrachis Saphonis. We come to the northeastern corner. Saphonis Maravis. Then we come to the northwestern corner, Maravis Doromis, and then we come to the southwestern corner. So we've navigated anti-clockwise around our Mizbeach, and we've sprinkled on all 4 of those corners. Then we come back down the ramp, and Shiare Hadam, and the rest of the blood, Hayashofech al Yesod Dorami, would be poured out on the southern foundation, the southern base of the altar, or it's actually in the southwestern corner, but that's where, so you're turning right once you come off the Mizbeach, and you're going to pour the blood into that southwestern foundation, and then v'ne'echalin, one second, v'ne'echalin lifnim min ha'kla'in, the meat that would get eaten gets eaten within the temple confines. So it has to be eaten min haklayim, within the curtains, which means within the perimeter of the temple courtyard. But it only goes to lezichrei chuhuna. It only goes to the male kohanim. B'chol ma'achal. It can be eaten in any. It can be prepared to be eaten in any way. It can be cooked. It can be roasted, which we'll see later is unlike a korban pesach, which had to only be roasted. So it can be eaten in any way. Lion valayla ad chatzos. And you have one day, and you have that night until midnight to be able to eat that korban. It's actually officially the whole night to be able to eat it, but we put the safeguard in place of chatzos so that we don't run the risk of that korban becoming nosar, becoming left over. Mishnah Daled, another level down. We move to the korban olah, which is still kodshin kalim. It's still the highest, the higher tier of sacrifices, but it only gets applied twice. The blood only gets applied twice. So the olah gets totally consumed, and it can be public and it can be private. So says the Mishnah, ha'olah kodshe kodshin. It's still in the realm of kodshe kodshin. Shchitasa b'tzafon. It gets slaughtered in the north. The kibul dama b'chli sharetz b'tzafon. The blood gets collected in the vessel in the north. The dama ta'un shtei matanos shehin arba. It gets 2 applications, which really are 4, because you're applying them on the corners. So you're applying the blood on the diagonal corners, so that really it's hitting 4 sides, but it's only 2 applications, 2 sprinklings. Okay, so you're going to be doing this on the northeastern side and the southwestern side. Those are the 2 sides, and that's because the southwestern side is always the last place to sprinkle. Right, you're facing south as you come down the ramp, and west would be to your right. So that's always the final point for blood applications. So you're sprinkling on the northeastern and the southwestern side, then you're coming down, and what would happen is utuuna hefshet, and then the animal would need to be stripped of its skin. It would need to be flayed, and the hides would be given to the kohanim. V'nituach v'chalil le'ishin. And with regards to the cutting up of the korban into sections, that had to be done as well. You don't just throw the whole animal onto the mizbeach. It would have to be cut up. So these large sections and the rest of the fats would have to be burnt up in its entirety on the altar, on the fire of the mizbeach. Mishnah Hey, 1 level down, where we are talking again about kodshe kodshin, the higher tier, but we're talking about a sacrifice that doesn't get completely burnt on the mizbeach. So the blood application is the same as the olah, which is why it's one level down from the ones that we saw before, but it's also 1 level down from an olah because it's not completely burnt up. So we're going to be talking about Shalmei Tzibur. We're going to be talking about the communal peace offerings, which, for example, on Shavuot, would be a public korban consisting of 2 sheep on Shavuot. It would be brought with 2 loaves of bread. So that's going to be one of them. So Zavchei Shalmei Tzibur, the sacrifice of the communal peace offerings, Va'ashamos, and the guilt offerings. And we're going to see there's a whole list of guilt offerings that get included in this category. So Elu Hein Hashamos. These are the guilt offerings, or the shame offerings. Asham Gazelos, the guilt offering for theft or for robbery. So, for example, someone claims you owe him money. You swear in front of Beis Din that you don't. Then it's found out that you swore falsely. You would have to bring an asham gazelos, asham me'ilos, the guilt offering for misappropriating temple property, asham shifcha charufa, the asham offering that was brought for somebody who was intimate with a non-Jewish slave who was half free and half owned. So the asham of a shifcha charufa, the asham nazir, the asham that was brought by a nazir who had become impure during his period of Nazirus, and then he has to reset the count and bring a Korban Asham. The Asham Metzora, the Asham brought by a Metzora, someone with Soras, who is going through his purification process. Asham Talui, which is a kind of limbo Korban. If somebody was not sure whether they had to bring a Korban Chatas, so before that situation could be resolved, they would bring a Korban Asham Talui, this limbo provisional offering. So that's the categories of Asham, plus the Shamei Tzibur that we mentioned before. So what would the process be? The process would be as follows. Shchitasam b'tzafon, they get slaughtered in the north. The kibul daman b'chli shares b'tzafon, the blood gets collected in the north. The daman ta'un shtei matanos shnei nabar, there's 2 sprinklings, which is really 4, because it gets sprinkled on the northeastern side and the southwestern side. The daman ta'un shtei matanos shnei, I just did that bit. The ne'echal lifnim minaplayim, lezichrei chahuna, and the flesh that gets eaten by male kohanim within the confines of the temple courtyard. B'chol ma'achal can be prepared in any way. Liyom v'layla ad chatzos, and you get 1 day and 1 night until chatzot, until midnight, to be able to eat those different types of korbanot. Mishnah 6, we move 1 level down, and we also now come into kodshim kalim, the lower tier of the sacrifices, where we're going to see that the slaughtering and the receiving of the blood can be done anywhere in the Azara, but we're going to see that there are different time frames and different groups of people who can eat these different sacrifices. So we're going to see the Todah. So the Mishnah says HaTodah, the thanksgiving offering, which was a form of shlamim, but it's kodshim kalim, and it would come with 40 loaves of bread. So a person bringing a thanksgiving offering would also have to pay for these 40 loaves of bread. 4 types of bread, 10 loaves each. So we'll discuss that in more detail elsewhere, but that's the Korban Todah. Then the Mishnah says, Ve'el Nazir, the Nazirites ram. So when they actually finish their process, we have a Asham Nazir, which was when they lose their count, but the El Nazir, the ram, is brought at the end of the period of Nazarism. So this guy is going to bring a ram. It's going to be a private shlamim, private peace offering. He's going to bring 20 loaves of bread, 2 types of bread, 10 each. So says the Mishnah. Hatodah ve'el Nazir, kodshim kalim, these are lower tier sanctity. Shechitasam b'chol makom ba'azara, they can be slaughtered anywhere in the Azara. V'daman ta'un shtei matanos she'in abar, and there's going to be 2 sprinklings on the Mizbeach, which are really 4, on the northeastern side and the southwestern side. V'ne'echalin b'chol ha'ir, they can be eaten in the whole of Yerushalayim. L'chol adam, by anybody. B'chol ma'achol, prepared in any way. Liyom v'layla ad chatzos, and they can be prepared. They can be eaten for 1 day and 1 night until chatzos. As long as the person is tahor, they can eat this sacrifice. Hamura, says the Mishnah. What about the parts that get separated and waved by the Kohen? So we're talking about if it's a Korban Todah, the back right leg and the chest of the animal, plus 4 loaves of bread. If we're talking about the ram of the Nazir, we're talking about the front and back right legs and the chest and 2 loaves of bread. So what about those parts, those subsidiary parts that get waved and separated, or separated and waved? Hamura mehen kayotze bahem. So the categories that we saw for the sacrifice applies also to these separated portions. So kayotze bahem is telling us that they can only be eaten in Yerushalayim and only for 1 day and 1 night. So the Mishnah says, Ela shehamuram ne'echal kohanim. But those separated parts can only be eaten by kohanim, linishehem and their wives, v'livnehem and their children, v'lavdehem and their servants. So those separated portions get given to the kohanim. Mishnah Zayin, another level down. Shlamim, the peace offerings, which are kodshim kalim, they are the lower level of sacrifices. Shchitasan, So we'll see these have a longer time for eating. They can be eaten, slaughtered anywhere in the courtyard, and their blood can be collected there as well. They get 2 applications on the Mizbeach, which are really for northeast and southwest. They get eaten in the whole of Yerushalayim, by any pure person, with any preparation. But the length of time that you have is longer. You get 2 days, and you get the 1 night in between. So you have until sunset of the 2nd day to be able to eat this sacrifice. Hamuram mehem. What about the bits that get separated off? The back right leg and the chest. Kayotze bahem. Same rules apply. Ella shehamuram ne'chal kohanim, but they can only be eaten by the kohanim, l'neshehem, l'ivnehem, l'avdehem, by their wives, by their children, and by their servants. Final Mishnah for tonight. Mishnah Ches, the lowest level, only has 1 sprinkling. Right? Remember, we've had the highest, most severe levels of sprinkling all the way down to our final Mishnah here. Says the Mishnah, Habachor, the firstborn offerings, the Hamaser, and the tithed offerings, the animal tithes. So 1 out of every 10 animals that gets born would be given as a korban. The HaPesach, korban Pesach, Kodshim Kalim. These are our lower tier levels of sanctity. Shchitas and b'chol makom ba'azara. They can be slaughtered anywhere in the azara. V'daman ta'un matana echas. And they only get sprinkled once on the Mizbeach. Uvilvad she'iten keneged ha'yesod. But they have to be sprinkled on the side of the Mizbeach that has a base. So it's the lower part of the Mizbeach above a part which has a base. So that excludes most of the eastern and the southern sides. Shina va'achilasan. There is a difference with the way these get eaten. Habachor ne'echal kohanim. The firstborn offerings get eaten by kohanim. Va'ma'aseh l'chol adam. The tithe offerings can be eaten by anybody, as long as they're pure. V'ne'echalin b'chol ha'ir l'chol adam. And they can be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim, b'chol machol, with any type of preparation. Lishnei yamin v'layla echad. And you have 2 days and 1 night. What about the korban Pesach? How appropriate is that to finish it off in our last shir before breaking up for Pesach? Mishnah says, Ha-Pesach eino ne'echal ela v'layla. The korban Pesach only gets eaten at night. Ve'eino ne'echal ela ad chatzos. And you only have until halachic midnight to eat the korban. Ve'eino ne'echal ela min yoav. It can only be eaten by the people who have registered for that particular korban. Ve'eino ne'echal ala tzali, and it can only be eaten roasted. Mazel tov, ladies and gentlemen, on finishing chapter 5. Please God, in the next couple of days, Mashiach will come. We'll be eating our korban Pesach together in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, with all of the rules. We all know how it works now, guys. It's going to be a piece of cake for us. Obviously not chametz cake. But with that, I wish you all mazel tov on completing chapter 5, and we'll see you all next time for the next Mishnah Mastery Shir. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll see you again very